Hey, fifth period. Welcome to our presentation about Webb Du Bois and American civil rights during the Progressive Era, presented by myself, Artesia M., Alfredo M., and Jonathan C. Alright, who dis? None other than Webb Du Bois. Du Bois was a reformer, journalist, activist, novelist, critic, and a philosopher. However, his race as a black man is what kept him from progressing. Du Bois' view on society is that it's built up on race and that the white man succeeds while the African American man faces lots of implications. His famous quote down below on the left is what he believed the black race as a whole must focus on to make change. Du Bois, along with Alexander Crummell and William Pickens, founded the American Negro Academy on March 5, 1987. The American Negro Academy was an organization of black intellectuals who, through scholarships and writing, promoted African Americans in the education, arts, and science fields. Du Bois also, along with other black intellectuals, created the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, which we'll get into detail later. Du Bois published many books and pieces of writing between 1896 to 1969, showing the struggles of black folks and opposing racism. He also insisted on full civil rights and political representation. A few books he wrote were The Souls of Black Folks, The Negro, and The Dusk of Dawn. Now, let's talk about the Negro problem. The Negro Problem was a collection of 7 essays written by prominent black American writers, mainly Webb Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, and the majority of the Negro Problem essays discuss writers' opinion on the best method to uplift the black race post-Civil War. Du Bois' famous essay in this collection, The Talented Tenth, as you can see on the right, is basically an essay of Du Bois arguing that the best method to uplift the black race is to step up the efforts for education, and he himself advocated for a classical education for black individuals with the highest potential. Now, let's talk about Jim Crow laws in the Progressive Era. Jim Crow laws were a set of laws and customs that aimed to segregate African Americans and people of color. The laws intended on restricting social contact and interactions between white people and other groups, specifically African Americans. And as you can see from the images below, that shows the law in effect from restrooms to laundry to many others. Now, in talking about the history of Jim Crow laws, on top of Jim Crow laws, there were black codes, which were strict local and state laws that detailed when, where, and how formerly enslaved people could work. The codes was a legal way to put black citizens into indentured servitude, took away voting rights, and even controlled where and how they live. You can see in this image of the OG Jim Crow in the song and Dance of Rice, and this image is showcasing what's called blackface. Blackface was people that wore makeup to imitate the appearance of a black person and was made a subject to white humor. Blackface was also a big part of Jim Crow, as the OG Jim Crow was portrayed as blackface, and the overall race of African Americans was a subject to white humor. Now, a positive to this, in 1869, the 15th Amendment was signed and outlawed the denial of voting rights due to color, race, or past servitude. Finally, some damn progress. Before we get into context and all that, tell me this image doesn't look dope. Like, damn, that takes skill right there. Alright, now this image shows the extremities and amount of power white people had. You can see it says White League as well as this is a white man's government. You can also see this Ku Klux Klan member and this man who I'm assuming is white standing over two black people that don't look too pleased with their life. Now let's talk about grandfather clauses. Grandfather clauses was a constitutional mechanism that was passed by 7 southern states during Reconstruction that denied suffrage to black folks. They worked effectively to exclude black people from voting and reassured the vote of whites. The purpose of these clauses were to prevent illiterate and poor African American former slaves and their descendants from voting. But in 1915, the Supreme Court had declared the clauses unconstitutional because it violated equal voting rights that were guaranteed in the 15th Amendment. Now, grandpops here can vote. In this image, you can see the group of white men putting in their votes and the group of black people attempting to vote and even taking hats off as a form of begging to vote.
African Americans were denied simple rights like the rights to vote, the rights to a fair trial, the rights to government services, the rights to public education, and the rights to use public facilities. A strategy the government used in order to stop African Americans from having these rights were literacy tests. They made literacy tests required in order for citizens to vote. And these literacy tests were employed by Southern state legislatures and were enforced primarily to keep people of color and immigrants from voting. These literacy tests were a problem because even if you were a well educated African American who got all the answers right, you could still fail because the officials administering the tests could easily fail you if they wanted to. Time and time again, African Americans experienced discrimination from many racist white Americans because at that time it was a normal thing for them to be outwardly racist. There were a lot of crimes committed against African Americans, and in response to the ongoing violence against African Americans, the NAACP was formed. The founders consist of Ida B. Wells, Oswald Garrison Villard, Webb Du Bois, William English Walling, Mary White Ovington, and Henry Moskowitz. The NAACP protested against murder, violence, and racial discrimination done against African Americans. Segregation was a giant problem for African Americans since they had no other choice but to face it and have to deal with not having the same luxuries that white people had. And a case that came directly out of segregation was Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy was a black man who was arrested for refusing to sit in the colored section of the coach he was in. He argued that he was 7/8 white and deserved to sit in the white section, but was considered a black man under Louisiana law. He argued that the segregation law was unconstitutional and that it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Unfortunately, the outcome was that the court voted that the state wasn't going against the amendments and that segregation was separate but equal, as well as constitutional. Fortunately, 58 years later, in Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, the conclusion was that the court ruled that racial segregation of children in public schools was unconstitutional and banned it.
What is segregation? Segregation was the systematic separation of people due to their skin color or ethnic group. For some weird ass reason, it was believed that white and black people could not coexist. I don't know why people thought that. Don't ask me. I'm not part of the problem. Jim Crow laws and segregation lasted from the late 19th century up until the 1950s. Let me give you an example of how it went down. So, white people ran up on black people, were like, yo, we don't want you messing around with our system. Y'all are stupid. Y'all are ugly. Y'all stink. You remind me of this person right here. None other than Beetlejuice himself. Nah, I'm just playing. But for real, it caused a lot of controversy, a lot of confusion. People were like, what do we do? How did this happen? What is the main problem? Now, the main problem for white people was race mixing. People thought that they were better off segregated, that black people were burdens and nothing but burdens. They believed this because of all the crimes that were being committed. Now, what do you do when you see a crime being committed? You call them out. You call the police. You rat them out. It could be something from as big as assault to something as little as owning a lemonade stand. If you know this woman from this picture, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But what they did was something a little more serious, or a lot more serious, and a lot more disturbing. Something known as lynching. Now, lynching was supposed to be a form of punishment for some very serious crimes without trial, without going to court. But white people took it as a way to torture and kill African Americans, innocent African Americans. Let me get into the context of this. So, lynching was justified by quote unquote taking matters into their own hands, also known as distributing justice without trial. They wouldn't go to court for this. They would just believe, they would think that African Americans did something wrong and take it out on them. Not only that, they were murdered simply because they were disliked. It was a racial thing, a racial problem. White people did not like black people, so they were like, you know what? I think you did something very bad. Let me get rid of you, even though I'm not sure. Now, as you can see by this picture, you can see, even though the years are a little bit off, This is how many people were roughly lynched during the Progressive Era. Very, very sad, very disappointing. But this wasn't the only problem. See, voting rights was also a problem. White people were like, no, 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 we don't want you messing around with our system. And that obviously pissed off a lot of African Americans. But remember, we're still in the Progressive Era. So it it affected both African Americans and women. Women were out here in the streets protesting for the right to vote. And by 1896, women had gained the right to vote in 4 states, including Wyoming, Colorado, Idaho, and Utah. But obviously, this wasn't enough. So they kept on protesting and protesting until in 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified and it declared that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So this was a huge W for women everywhere. So you still had women fighting for the right to vote and African Americans fighting for the right to vote. Now we need a solution for both of those. So what you get? The Niagara movement. Now what is this? Obviously, it was the best album to ever be created. No, I'm kidding, but tell me this album cover isn't heat. Alright, but the founders include Webb Du Bois, William Monroe Trotter, and Mary Brunette Talbert. This was this was an organization that fought for civil rights for African Americans everywhere. African American men and women. Now, this forcefully demanded equal economic and educational opportunity as well as the vote for black men and women. As you can see here in this picture, you can see the logo and a picture of the annual meeting in Boston in 1907. Now, this organization was one of the organizations that paved the way for the formation of the NAACP. And to the right, you can see this picture, which is a quote from the Niagara Movement speech from Webb Du Bois. And with that being said, thank you for watching our presentation. We hope you enjoyed.